This is a video in which we show how we expect our students to pre-flight this M model Cessna 172 at I Fly Aviation in Eugene, Oregon. The pre-flight inspection starts as we walk up to the airplane. We want to take a look and make sure that, for instance, the wings are still on and that there is a propeller, that the tires look to have adequate pressure, that none of the wings or horizontal or vertical stabilizers or any of the control surfaces have been damaged in some way. And so that's our first look. Then we approach the plane. We come around to the pilot's door. And as we get inside, the first thing we do is to turn on the master switch. Then we turn on all of the other switches, lights. We look at the fuel gauges to make sure that it looks like we've got enough fuel, and we put the flaps in the down position. Having done that, we then go outside the plane and we check the switches that we just turned on. So we come back to the back of the plane, and here we can see that the rotating red beacon is flashing. We can see that the white position light on the top of the back of the tail is on. We come on around to the end of the right wing, and here we should see a flashing strobe and a green light, which we have. And then we come around to the front of the plane and we check to make sure that we have an operating landing light. We come on around to the pitot tube and we touch it to make sure that it is heating. You don't want to leave your hand on there a long time. They get hot enough that they could actually take your skin off. So we just tap it and make sure that it's heating. And then we come around to the end of the other wing and we see that we have the strobe is flashing and we have the red position light on this end. So that completes our check of the electrical equipment that we turned on when we first entered the plane. So we get back in and we turn off all of them except for the rotating beacon, and we leave the rotating beacon on. Then we turn off the master switch. Now we start the exterior check of the plane. So we go back here to the baggage door and we make sure that the baggage door is closed. In many cases we want to lock it, and then we go down the fuselage. We're looking for any wrinkles or bends or anything that looks unusual that might indicate that there has been damage to the structure underneath, that is, under the skin. And then we look at the left horizontal stabilizer, again looking for wrinkles or dents or bends, and we check all of the hinge points to make sure that they have either a castle nut with a cotter pin or a self-locking nut, because we don't want those to come loose in flight. The next thing we do is we lift the elevator and we look at the cables for the rudder. Again, looking to see that the castle nut has a cotter pin and the cables are not frayed. We come on around to the other side, of the rudder, and we look into all of these openings to make sure that the bolt and nut are as they should be. We look at the actuating rod with the castle nut and the cotter pin that should be there. We look at the piano hinge on the trim tab. We look underneath and make sure that there's a castle nut with a cotter pin still in place on that side. And while we're down here, we take a look at the cable on this other side, on the right side of the plane, the cable that goes to the horn for the rudder. We come back up, again looking for any unusual dents or cuts or any other problems with the horizontal stabilizer. And then we come down the right side of the fuselage looking for any dents or wrinkles. When we get to the back of the flap, we take a look at the flap tracks, and looking again to make sure that all of the inspection plates have their nuts in them. This is a good time to step back and look down at the wheel and see if there is apparently any leaking hydraulic fluid for the brakes, and there does not seem to be. We duck under, and always be careful when you go under these flaps, because they've got these triangular shaped holes that are part of the stiffening ribs in there, and most Cessna pilots end up with triangular shaped scars as they run into these. So be very careful when you duck under those or when you're around the back of the ailerons. We tuck under, and we're going to reach into the back of the seat and pull out a couple of things that we're going to need. One of these is for testing the fuel, and this is a GATS jar. There are other kinds of fuel testers, but this particular kind allows you to pour the fuel back into the tank, so it's a little more environmentally friendly and saves us a little bit of fuel. So on these older Cessnas, there's only one point to check the fuel under each wing. So we drain some fuel into the jar, and then we look to make sure that it is a light blue color and there are no water drops that will go to the bottom and no dirt or sediment in there. The newer Cessna 172s have 5 drain points per wing and 3 under the belly, so there's a lot more to check on the newer ones, but these older ones just have the 1 point. Now we're going to hang on to that fuel. There's another item that we got out of the back of the seat, and that is a tube for checking the fuel level in the tanks, because we always check those manually. We don't just trust the fuel gauges. And the way it works is we set this down into the tank all the way and then put a finger on top and draw it out. It's calibrated, and we can read on the calibrated tube how much fuel is left in the tank, and then we release it and let the fuel go back into the tank. So we'll do that here in a few minutes, and we'll do that on each tank. So we're going to continue our pre-flight of the plane, and we will look at the flap tracks to make sure they look like they are intact and no excessively rubbed or broken areas. And we take a hold of the actuating rod, and it should turn left and right, but it should not move fore and aft. And we continue on and look at the other flap track. And then we're going to check inside here on the ailerons. So for one thing, we're going to be looking at the piano hinge, each of the piano hinges, make sure that all of the bolts appear to be in place. We'll come down here and check this one, and we will also check the actuating rod on this one. We'll come on down and look at the outboard piano hinge and make sure that it looks as it should. We continue on around, and we are now looking for any unusual dents or wrinkles in the wings, and those would indicate structural damage, which we do not want. So when we get over here to the leading edge of the wing at its root, we're going to step back here where we have a ladder ready, and we're going to put this ladder up next to the plane. Now we do that, I'll step back here so you can see the ladder. We do that so that we can go up and manually check the fuel. So this red cap is the fuel cap. We will open that. We'll get the level tester that I mentioned earlier, and we set that down into the tank. We put a finger on top and we pull it up, and we can see right now we have over 19 gallons, so this 21-gallon tank is pretty well full. We release our finger from the top, and that allows the fuel to flow back in. At this point, we can go ahead and get that fuel testing GATS jar, and we can pour the fuel back in. We pour it in through the screened part, not through the holes, and when we pour it through the screened parts, it'll screen out anything that should not go back into the tank. Now when we put the fuel cap back on, we need to make sure that we get it all the way back so that the sort of fin on top is parallel with the longitudinal axis of the airplane. If it's left partly loose, the same lift that lifts our wings could also lift the fuel out of the tank. So we make sure that those are back on there very securely. And then we'll get back off of the ladder on this side, doing our best not to fall off the ladder. And we'll come around to the oil filler door. So we open that. Way down inside, and you'll have to kind of feel for this, there is a square plastic knob, and we lift up on that, and that's going to shoot some fuel out under the plane. That's draining the lowest part of the fuel system, so any water or dirt that has gotten into it and traveled down that far should be released. Then the other thing we do inside here is we take the dipstick loose, and we lift it up. We try to leave the tip of it in the oil filler tube so that we don't drip oil around on the inside of the engine compartment. There are calibrations on here, and so the maximum oil capacity is 8. We generally don't fill it all the way to 8. 7 is more normal, and right now we have about 6 1/3 quarts of oil, and that's plenty. So when we get down to 6, we would go ahead and add another quart. So we don't tighten that up very far because it tends to tighten up as we fly, and if you get it very tight now, more than finger tight, then it'll be nearly impossible to remove later. We close that door, and then we come on around to the front and we check the condition of the propeller. We especially check the leading edge. We're looking for any kinds of cracks or chips, because the aluminum propeller will act a little like a windshield in a car, in that if you have a crack or a chip, that might actually travel and you could lose a piece of the propeller, which is disastrous. So we don't want that to happen. I'm going to move the propeller a little bit, and we can look inside this opening, and there is an alternator belt. So we check the tension of the alternator belt. I generally, when I come down under the plane, will just give a little bit of a shake to the exhaust pipe, make sure that it feels like it is clamped on there securely. We've already checked the landing light. And now we're going to look at the air filter, make sure that it's not clogged or blocked by anything. And while we're down here, we're going to look at the front strut, and there should be at least 2 fingers width from the bottom flange up to the one that's just on the bottom of the aircraft, because that's our shock absorber, and we need to be able to have travel on that to provide shock absorption on the nose of the airplane mainly when we land. So we'll come back up, and we're going to check the other blade of the propeller. Come on around, and again we're looking for any loose screws or any screws that might be missing or any apparent damage to the plane. And then we come to the static port, and we check to make sure that it does not look like it's obstructed. I teach my students not to put a finger on it, because you can get oils from your finger in the hole, and then that oil will attract dirt, and you could end up with a blocked static port. So again, while we're on this side, it's a good time to take a look at the front wheel. Does the tire look like it has air? Is there any hydraulic fluid leaking from the brakes? And then I'm going to have to walk back over here and get the ladder, because we're going to need to check the fuel on this side. So on the way up the ladder, I'm going to reach over and get the fuel level testing tube that we left on the cowling earlier, and we'll come up here and we'll open this cap. Put a finger on top, lift it up. I'm going to have to turn it around so I can see the calibration. And we have about 18 on this side, so it's nearly as full as the other side. There is a crossover tube, so generally these tanks will equalize unless you're parked on an angle, on a slope, and then sometimes the fuel will drain from one side over to the other. Alright, now we'll come back down off the ladder, attempting not to fall off. We'll take a look at the pitot tube. We already felt it to make sure that it was heating, but we need to make sure that the hole on the end of it is not obstructed. And there's a drain hole further back, and we need to make sure that that's not obstructed either. Then we come on along and we see the stall horn, which really is a very simple mechanism. It acts a lot like when we blow across the top of a pop bottle, a soda bottle. When the wing gets steep enough to the relative wind, then it will set up kind of a howling sound that we call a horn, and that's how we can know that we're 5 or 10 knots above the stall. We want to make sure, again, that no bugs have built nests in there or there's any other obstruction. Hiding behind the strut is the vent for the fuel tank, and again, we need to make sure that there's no obstruction to that. Here, I got to get it so that you can actually see it. There we go. So there is the vent for the fuel tank. We come back around. We're looking at the leading edge still of the wing, making sure that there are no dents from birds or other problems with the leading edge of the wing. We come around to the back of the left wing. We look at all of the piano hinges. We activate we turn the activating rod, make sure it turns but does not go fore or aft. We look at the next piano hinge. We look at the flap tracks. We twist the activating rod, make sure that it twists but has no forward and aft play. And then I'm going to have to step back over here and get the fuel tester that I left on the front of the plane. All right, we've got that. And we come back under the wing and we take a fuel sample. Some people take more than that. Over the years I've found it doesn't take a huge one as long as you can see that it is light blue. If there's any question about its color, then you do want to take more, because water or jet fuel would be white, but as long as it's all light blue, generally I find about a ½ inch or so in these gas jars is enough. So now we have completed our external walk around, and we've done that by what many people call a flow. And to me, a flow is a logical sequence for accomplishing a set of tasks. And so I teach my students to do the pre-flight by a flow. But that flow done from memory is not the whole story, because we do have a pilot operating handbook in this plane, and the pilot operating handbook is really the final word on anything having to do with operation of the plane, including the pre-flight. So we pull that out, and inside we will find a section that has to do with, it's a page here that has a diagram, and it shows that you start at the pilot's door and you go around just the way we did, and you'll find a full listing of all of the things that have to be checked. And so it's a good idea to go through that, particularly when you're a newer pilot and you're not as familiar with the pre-flight sequence of checks and the full range of things that need to be checked. Sometimes you'll find that you've actually missed something, and so we always want to check the pilot operating handbook, because the POH, as we call it, rules. Now, these older ones, sometimes they're called owner's manuals, but you'll hear these commonly referred to as a POH. So that completes our pre-flight of this 1973 M model 172.